The topic today is Design for Wellness, the Future of Medicine and How to Integrate it into our communities. Psychedelic and other natural medicines are already here and will become more commonplace. This panel will discuss how design will play a critical role in integrating natural medicine into the health community, our neighborhoods, and broadly into society. So I've already given my welcome. Let's start with Barina, who's a lawyer at Vicente. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and involvement with how we've come to this point in psychedelic legalization in Colorado.
Great. Hi. Is this working? Yeah. Okay. Hi, guys. I'm Barina Majewska. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Vicente. Prior to this whole psychedelic movement, I was doing a lot of cannabis law, branding, IP agreements, that kind of stuff. My background is in various types of corporate law, but a few years back in my career, I went to Johns Hopkins and I was a research assistant on their psilocybin studies. And these medicines were important to me for a lot of my life, and getting to see the research that they were doing up close, participating as a guide on their studies and doing a lot of the data crunching for their papers really got me super lit up for it, more so than I already was. And it was with that background that when the psychedelic movement sort of started back up, I, along with Josh Capel, who's one of the founding partners at Vicente, became the head of our psychedelic practice group. So Josh was really instrumentally involved in writing the language of Prop 122, and then also all the sort of iterations and variations of what is actually now in effect as law. And I was involved more in the background in terms of all the different issues we were chewing on, and what happens if this is written like this, and what happens if it's written like that. So that was a lot of my involvement there. I have so many clients in the psychedelic space right now. There are people trying to enter this space from all different levels, all different aspects, from huge institutions looking to create retreat centers and bring in money, to legacy facilitators that have been operating underground for decades and like really know this craft very, very well, and are sort of worrying about how their practice is going to continue in light of the new legalization in Colorado. So,
Barina, tell us a little bit about what Proposition 122 did in terms of what substances it addressed and what activities it allowed.
Yeah, so it's worth noting the Colorado voters passed Prop 122 last fall. And then what happened in April is the implementing bill by the Senate, which is supposed to happen, came in with all the details of how it was going to be implemented. And there were a few iterations of that. The first one, in my mind, didn't do a great job of kind of honoring the intent of Prop 122 of what was passed by the voters. And a lot of Coloradans showed up to the Senate hearings and were saying, this is not what we wanted. And then I thought they responded really favorably, and they passed Senate Bill 23290. This is useful background to have if you guys see this talked about, because the original Prop 122 and then the implementing Bill 290 look a little bit different. But in the end, I think what was actually signed into law last May and went into effect in July was quite close to the intent of the voters. So tell us what it allows. Broadly, it's helpful to think of Prop 122 as it was implemented as having two prongs. One is the regulated access prong, and so this is state licensed, state regulated healing centers, facilitators, and the medicine, like the supply chain of the actual medicine. It's all regulated by the state, and it's all you need licenses to be at any stage of that, let's call it ecosystem, right? So that's the regulated access model, and that's not in effect yet. They're trying to make the rules for that right now, and the earliest that we expect applications to start being accepted is the beginning of 2025. So they're working really hard right now. There's a board, the Natural Medicine Advisory Board. You can attend a lot of their meetings as a listener. There's a bunch of subcommittees that make recommendations to the board. So that's one whole piece, and I'll say a bit more about that. And for right now, initially, that will only cover psilocybin. So that won't cover the other medicines. And there is a prioritization of ibogaine being up next, kind of as something for them to consider included on the regulated piece. So that's all regulated. And then the other prong is what's known as the personal use prong, but it's not only personal use. The reason it's called personal use is because under the definition of the word personal use in the statute, it allows sharing of the medicine, and also the amount that you need to cultivate or keep or hold for your own personal use, which is also not a defined amount. But so you'll hear people talking about practicing under personal use today, because a lot of facilitators who aren't waiting for the regulation to get implemented are practicing under what's known as personal use today. Neither of these, well, specifically personal use, does not allow any sale of medicines. So sales are just completely prohibited. Regulated sales through that very highly regulated license system will be allowed on the regulated model once it's implemented, but never on personal use. As far as I can tell, there's no intent to allow sales. So that's important to note, because there's a lot of mushroom companies popping up online and stuff, and all of that is illegal. So it's important to know that. And then on the personal use side, the medicines covered are psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, but excluding peyote, and ibogaine. You can't share ibogaine, so that's worth noting. That's the only medicine that's covered that's strictly personal use on the personal, like actual use by an individual on the personal use side.
Thank you, Brina. That's a lot of ground to cover, but we wanted to kind of give a high level of what's allowed and permissible and what you're allowed to do here in Colorado. So now we'll pivot to our doctors. So Doctors Voss and Laptizia, if you can each introduce yourselves and just tell us a little bit about your practice and your backgrounds and how you're incorporating these new possibilities into what you're doing.
Sure. Hi, I'm Dr. Voss Heliopoulos. I'm in private practice up in Boulder. I'm traditional MD, board certified in emergency medicine, and we opened a practice almost a decade ago in Boulder, where I guess longevity medicine is what we practice. We've been practicing with ketamine our whole careers. Ketamine exclusively as a treatment for mental illness and cognitive optimization over the last decade in the clinic in Boulder. We currently don't, we will help people who have obtained their own psilocybin with microdosing and macrodosing protocols, but just in an advisory capacity. So.
Yeah, and my name is Kushal Latifzai. I'm one of the partners at the medical practice up in Boulder. I went to Dartmouth Medical School many years ago, and afterwards I trained at Yale University in emergency medicine. Voss and I were partners at an emergency medicine group here in the Denver, Boulder area. And in that setting, we've got tons of experience as far as using ketamine as an anesthetic. And then there's some additional uses of ketamine beyond just using it to help mask pain in the setting of injuries. And that includes its use as a really potent antidepressant, anxiolytic for anxiety, for PTSD, for chronic pain. And so we brought that to our clinic, Rocky Mountain Regenerative Medicine, where our focus is just to empower one's own biology to heal itself. And as Voss alluded to, in that context, ketamine is used for optimization of one's psychological health, mental well-being. So,
really interesting. So again, ketamine already commonly applied out there in a broad use of ranges. And finally, I want to introduce Natasha, last but far from least. Tell us about yourself, Natasha, and how you work with psychedelic medicines and how your various experiences have led you to work with people.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha.
You might just have to hold it a little closer.
Okay. My name is Natasha Lannard. Let's see, where to begin with this story. As a child, I experienced a very high level of trauma beginning at a very early age. And I had my first therapeutic psychedelic experience when I was 18 years old. And without going into details, I can tell you in a summary that I lost my mom to a brain tumor when I was 6 years old, and the first time I was able to cry about it was in that therapeutic session when I was 18, where a family member sat me down and sat with me and gave me psilocybin, and I wailed for hours. And after that experience, I was like, it's okay. I knew in every cell of my body that this medicine was going to save people's lives, and I was going to be one of those people who got their lives saved. I'm 38 years old, so I've been doing this work personally for 20 years now. I just turned 38. And I can say with the highest level of certainty that, like, for people who have been through experiences such as myself, and again, like what I just said to you is only one part of the story, there's only a certain amount of talking about it that would have helped. And this opens the door to something, and I know there are people in this audience who feel me on this. This opens the door to something and a level of healing and reclamation that you're not going to get anywhere else. So fast forward to today, I've had the honor, I've studied with people that have been doing this work kind of more on the underground for over 30 years, and have now transitioned into, in addition to doing this work for myself, holding space for other people, especially people like me who have a background and have experienced a lot of trauma, to reclaim those pieces of themselves that were left behind in those experiences. I would say my day job has ranged from the CPG natural foods industry. I've been in the cannabis sector for 9 years, and I primarily have been focused on commercializing products, more recently services, and then also was an ambassador on the Prop 122 campaign. So there's a lot of lessons I feel like that both personally and then professionally that kind of brought me here to this conversation today, so I'm excited to be here with all you guys.
And Natasha, talk a little bit about how you already work with people on a one-to-one basis and maybe on other ratios with psychedelic medicines and what you do.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a range of a few different things. I've done a lot of done a lot of training in holotropic inspired breath work, which is completely substance free and insanely effective. If anyone's ever done it, it's wild medicine, just your breath. And then also have sat with people in a range of different substances, both in the individual and group context, with psilocybin, San Pedro Huachuma cactus, which is a mescaline, and I have helped integrate people who have done ketamine as well, and MDMA. So full range of people, full range of ages, and usually I would say people either come to you most usually through word of mouth. And Brandon can go more into this, but there's no advertising in this business, and given the risk that people such as myself take, it's really important that the people that come to me understand that we're doing this together, and the risk that we're all taking to make sure that they have an opportunity to heal themselves, which is something that I feel like at the core should be a fundamental right that people have. And yeah, so it can take a range of, again, in a group practice, it kind of has a different dynamic because you're in a group, and oddly enough, one person's download might be another person's lesson. When you're sitting with individuals, it's usually with folks that are working on something specifically. I actually met with a client this weekend. We're starting a microdose protocol. He suffered from depression for over 30 years. He's tried everything, and we're going to start with a 6-week microdose protocol, and then we're going to do a deep dive, in the fall once he has an opportunity to develop a familiarity with the medicine. And so, again, ranging from depression, folks who have experienced abuse, and I would say one of the things I see people for a lot is folks that are struggling with grief, which is something that I'm obviously intimately familiar with.
Thank you. So hopefully you all can see why we assembled this group of speakers for this panel, to give a variety of perspectives on how medicines are already being used and dispensed in our communities, and how different sort of elements of our society are treating it. So I want to open up a question for everybody on the panel. What psychedelic medicines or other kind of alternative medicines are you seeing as the most commonplace today in the medical communities? Maybe we'll start with the docs here.
Yeah, ketamine is really the only legal substance that we can use at the practice. So I think people are probably familiar with seeing a lot of advertising for ketamine-related therapies. Psilocybin, of course, is now running a close second, just because access has been opened up. Although people use all kinds of psychedelic medications, LSD, the list I'm sure you guys are familiar with the list. You can microdose anything from MDMA to CBD to THC to any of the psychedelics, including psilocybin. So we're seeing more and more people at least being willing to talk about what they're using.
So you're seeing that kind of come into your practice, in that people are telling you about their use? Are you in any way interacting, not directly with those drugs, but giving any advice or guidance around the use of them?
So, so I guess we have to be careful about what we say we use and we don't use. And so all we use in the clinic is ketamine. But when I have a client who comes to me and asks for help with microdosing or macrodosing any substance, I do my best to support them in any way that I can to make sure that it's done safely and in a way that is going to be effective for them. And sometimes it's, linking them with somebody like Natasha. Sometimes it's talking them through dosing protocols. Sometimes it's advising them on what I think they shouldn't be doing. So I guess to really answer your question is the new law, and I'm used to calling it 122, but I don't know what we're supposed to be calling it now, has opened up people's sort of willingness to discuss what not only is available and curiosity around what's available, but also opening up about what they're already using.
And do you, just to follow up on that, do you see essentially pressure, like market pressure on the medical community to do more to respond to that, or is it still not really reaching
I don't
that
think
kind of
so. Do you? Yeah, I think what you're going to find is that we're very atypical. I mean, we're both traditionally trained MDs. We come from pedigreed institutions. There are not many doctors who are frankly open at all, despite the research that's been done at some of the most prestigious universities in the world, King's College, Hopkins, Ohio State, Vanderbilt, among others. There are a lot of traditional doctors who have a lot of skepticism that I think is based really on, preconceived stereotypes around psychedelic use in the 60s and 70s.
And I would just add that, the type of relationship that Vas and I have with our patients is probably significantly different than the type of relationship that most providers offer to their patients, to their clients. And so that's like an important consideration to take into account. In medicine, we love to hide behind this terminology, evidence-based medicine. And the reason that's important is because if you bring it up to a conventional, we are conventional doctors, right? We have medical degrees, but if you bring it to your run-of-the-mill doctor, the prospect of you doing psilocybin, it's like in their mind, they go back to like the DARE, the 1980s, the 1990s, and it's really kind of comical, And so most patients, either out of shame or whatever, they feel a reticence to bring it up to their doctors. And I think in conventional medicine, there's an over-reliance on conventional anxiolytics like benzodiazepines or antidepressants like SSRIs. And I think that's to the detriment of the medical community. And so I think the type of relationship that we've fostered with our patients is significantly different. And so if that concept sounds a little foreign to you based on your interaction with your doctor, just keep that in mind. Does that sort of make sense?
It certainly does. And I thought I heard you say Johns Hopkins earlier, so that sounds like traditional doctor place to me. For Brina and Natasha, we covered what we're seeing in the kind of traditional communities. I'm wondering what psychedelic medicines you're seeing most commonly in the natural healing and even in the recreational and illicit worlds. Brina, you talked about some of these companies that are popping up and their dubious legality. Tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah, right before I do that, can I just jump in with one legal
Please.
thing that might be obvious to you guys, but if not, might be helpful? Ketamine is not Schedule 1 federally. It's Schedule 2 in the Controlled Substances
3.
Act. 3, sorry. 3.
good.
I should know that. So it has an accepted medical use, right? So it doesn't need the same kind of protection that the rest of these medicines or the same kind of carve out that they're getting on the state level because it's federally recognized as a usable substance. So that's why there's so many ketamine clinics across the nation right now, because as long as you have a prescribing physician and you're doing it appropriately, it's not illegal, right? So it's in a different category, and that's why it wasn't included in Prop 122 as something legalized on the state level, and that's worth noting. And then the other interesting thing is, as these doctors are talking about supporting their patients in their use of medicine when the patients are coming to them asking questions, which I think is beautiful, and I wish more doctors would do that. If you're not providing the medicine, even before Prop 122 passed, and certainly after, it's not clear that you're kind of under the purview of Prop 122. So if you're someone who's providing harm reduction services or consulting or advisement, regardless of whether you're doing it in a capacity as a physician or just as someone, who provides those services, if you're not providing the medicine, you're probably not under the Natural Medicine Health Act. You might be at some risk or you may not be, depending on how it unrolls. We have like 0 cases to look at to see how prosecutors or judges would respond to it, but at least there's an argument that you can legally provide that kind of service as long as you're not handing someone the medicine. As soon as you're handing someone the medicine, if you're selling it, then it's just illegal, even on the state level. And if you're sharing it, then if you comply with all the restrictions of personal use, of which there are many, so definitely talk to someone before you do it, then you're under personal use, and you're presumably state legal, but federally illegal. Does that all make sense? I thought that was a distinction worth making.
It does, and I want to lean into that a little bit and talk about what is proliferating today in Colorado and other states. What is happening most commonly amongst, like I said, in the natural healing community and even in the illicit and recreational markets with these types of substances?
Yeah, I'll speak to more the business side, because that's who I'm seeing as clients, and it's a lot of psilocybin and ketamine. Like, that's most of it. You know, LSD is not protected under Prop 122. There's a lot of people who would be interested in LSD, is sort of the sense I get, but they can't do it in a state legal way. Lots and lots of psilocybin and ketamine. I suspect ibogaine might get some traction because of how promising it is for addiction in sort of an unprecedented way, but it has so many health risks that I think people are justifiably cautious. I think they should be cautious with that one.
Natasha, I trust you're seeing similar things. Can you talk about the shape and form that these products are taking, both in the literal medium that the substance might be in the types of communities that are developing where people are using them, and really how it looks?
So I think that one of the most important things about this is obviously there's been a lot of opening on the legal front that's making this more and more of a reality for people to come up from underneath the rocks they've been hiding under. This has been going on for a millennia, right? Like all around the world, in indigenous cultures, literally everywhere. There's a rite of passage that can be attributed to the use of psychedelic medicines. So when you think about the way people have been doing it, it's kind of the two things that I described. In groups, right? In community, because one of the biggest things that I think that I've witnessed personally is that, we've become separate from our environment, hence kind of where we ended up on climate change and where we are now, and we've also become separate from ourselves and subsequently each other. So there's a lot of community healing that goes along when people do medicine together, because the crisis of loneliness is very real, and there's a lot of evidence that supports that. So you're seeing people coming into these group contexts in order to not only, honestly, one of the number one things I see of people that come into groups are people who are no longer necessarily associated with their religious affiliation. Maybe they grew up in a church, and maybe the religion itself isn't something that they're looking to maintain, but the community is. That's a big part of it. So I think the community element is just as much part of the medicine. As far as the medicines that people are using, it's a full gamut. When I think about groups that I have supported in New Mexico, we do a big thing around, the San Pedro Huachuma, which is like a grandfather energy medicine, we're out there in the sun during the day in the desert. When it's the fall and I have somebody coming to my house on an individual one-on-one level, the most common thing that we do is psilocybin. So it really depends on what people are looking for. I feel like with grief, I feel like MDMA can be incredibly powerful for releasing into that and accepting some of the things, the pain that's associated with that. So I think that what you're gonna see is, obviously as this comes out, there's gonna be more and more, since the product itself is not gonna be something that is a commercial avenue necessarily. What is going to be commercialized is the services and the communities around these medicines. So what if I were to, as somebody who has commercialized a lot of widgets and things in my life, if I were to fast forward, especially for the topic of conversation today of how are people gonna be doing this, they're gonna be doing it how they're doing it now. But it's gonna have a lot more to do, your decision is gonna have a lot more to do with the community with which you're doing it, even on an individual level, right? Your association and connection with the facilitator, with their, with their ethos and connection, and then also communities that are built around very specific medicines, which Brina can speak more to this. There's churches that are specifically around specific substances, like ayahuasca, for example, right? There are churches of ayahuasca, there are churches of Huachuma. And so you're gonna see communities built around these medicines in singular focus. So I would say that if you're curious about how this looks, just look about how it's looked historically, and it's gonna look very similar.
And we're going to come back to that. Do you want to add to that, Brina? Coming back to the doctors, we're talking about the evolution of these substances, who's using them, how they're using them. You guys have already talked a little bit about the more open nature of your patients. Have you seen any evolution at all, or significant change in profile, and who's coming in and sharing about that, or is it kind of what someone might stereotypically expect? Can you talk about how that's evolved from when you say started administering ketamine to today? You guys can both weigh in.
So this was, it's a great question, because we started using ketamine in the clinic. And like Kaushal alluded to, we've used ketamine our whole careers as a sedative. But I have a buddy who I trained with who deployed multiple times. And so he's a physician, medical director at a VA. And he opened a ketamine clinic in Texas many, many years ago because of the personal experience he had and the benefit that he had seen with using ketamine therapeutically. He said, listen, if you're opening a clinic, you got to do ketamine. And, we looked at the research, and for anxiety, depression, PTSD, so for your hard sort of medical diagnoses, there was good research, so we started doing it. But what I found over time, and Kaushal alluded to it, our practice is not typical. We're up in Boulder, we're cash only, we spend a lot of time with our patients, we get to know our patients really, really well. They trust us on a level that I think is not typical in most doctor-patient relationships, because we can spend time with them, because of how we structured our practice. And what we found was a lot of our high-end clientele, often in the tech or the entrepreneurship space, were using ketamine as a cognitive optimization tool to problem solve around business, around personal decisions. And when I saw people of that level who, I respected, using it not on a routine basis, but on a sort of what we call on an as-needed basis, when you're sort of stuck at a juncture, whether that's in personal life or professional life. That's when I started thinking, like, man, if all these people are using it seemingly so effectively, like there's something more than just anxiety, depression, PTSD. And so I think we're in a community where people talk around about these things, they hear what other people are doing, and so the shift is not anything like what I think you would stereotypically think. I mean, we see, I'm trying to think of concrete examples to make it real, professional, husband, working, wife who was a professional who's now home taking care of kids, both highly educated, both highly functional, opening up to the possibility of like, well, I've been kind of feeling down, life, work, kids. I've talked to my doctor about it. They've suggested SSRIs or benzodiazepines. I don't really want to go that route. And when you say, some of them will actually ask, well, I've heard about psilocybin. Is that like, should I listen to that? Is this something I should consider? Or sometimes I'll mention it and say, you have other options. And so I think more and more it's sort of seeping into the everyday community. That's been my personal experience. I don't know if you have.
Yeah. And if you think about how ketamine works, there's this concept of the default mode network, which is like what our brain is doing when we're not thinking about anything in particular, like how we perceive the world. And that is shaped by decades and decades of experience, of just being alive. And if it turns out that you're an individual who is really optimistic, that didn't happen overnight. That's the way you grew up. If you are at the other end of the spectrum, someone who's depressed or maybe suspicious, that took decades and decades of work to sort of design, and that's the lens that you view the world through. And so ketamine is really sort of important in kind of rewiring that default mode network. And it does that through increasing a chemical in the brain that it's abbreviated BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it's a chemical that increases cell-to-cell communication between neurons. It helps promote formation of new neurons, and it helps over time, not overnight, but over time, rewire how we think about things. And so if you're someone who's depressed, who's anxious, and that's the product of decades of your childhood and your adulthood, ketamine helps retrain your brain. You've got to be open to it. It doesn't work the same way as, say, Tylenol, where if you're in pain, you get Tylenol or you get morphine, and it's pretty predictable that at the other end you're going to be pain-free in most cases. Ketamine takes a lot more homework, sort of the services that Natasha's talking about, where it does take a lot of introspection, working in groups, working through your issues, and sometimes it's really difficult to delve into those aspects of your life due to various pains that's associated with it. And ketamine helps you explore those little niches that may be really painful for you to do otherwise without the help of ketamine being on board. And so whether, like Vas was talking about, whether you're a high-powered CEO trying to look at how to rethink about or think differently about a certain problem that you've been grappling with for months and months, or if you're someone who's really in dire straits and you're depressed, you're anxious, you can't function, ketamine is really essential in kind of helping you navigate those rivers. And it doesn't work for everyone, but one of the common threads between ketamine and psilocybin and some of the other products that we're talking about is that it does increase those chemicals that helps rewire your brain, BDNF, VEGF being another one, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Really interesting, guys. I have one follow-up, and then I actually want to put a similar question to the two of you, Barina and Natasha, about the evolution of who you're seeing come into the space, either as a user or as a potential entrepreneur. But a quick question, and I'm a little iffy about asking, but I'm so curious I can't help myself. So you talk about high-level CEOs, well-developed professionals using ketamine on sort of an ad hoc, as needed basis. I'm curious, how are they sourcing that? Do you think? It's a real question. I mean, that's why I hesitated about asking.
So
but
ketamine.
The topic, the topic here is about how these substances are going to be designed into our community, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about how high-level professional people are finding these things. So, put you on the spot.
No, not on the spot at all. I mean, it's part of what we do in our practice, and so I think part of it is geographic, where we are. Part of it is how we designed our practice. We left traditional medicine because we were just tired of being on the hamster wheel, where you got to see somebody every 10, 15 minutes, and you don't have time to do anything really. The patients hate it, the providers hate it just as much, and we were tired of that. And so we wanted a different way to do medicine, and unfortunately what that meant was, because it's not, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was in emergency medicine because one of the key things about emergency medicine is you don't ask somebody if they can pay you before you take care of them. Now the hospital does, and that whole mess that happens it's a disaster, but that's part of why I went into medicine. And unfortunately, currently the reality is, if you want to have a true healing relationship with somebody, you can't do that on the time scale that insurers and payers are going to allot you. And so what that means is you have to opt out of that system, which means you have to go cash pay. And unfortunately, that means it changes your clientele. So sorry, I don't know if I'm sort of sidetracking, but this is why we're in touch with these kinds of people, and we do ketamine in the clinic. And so it was one of these. Again, I think we started with the hard indications, but what Kaushal's alluding to with what, and we talk about ketamine because that's what we do, but psilocybin, DMT, LSD, ayahuasca, MDMA, they all boost the production of BDNF. And we have an epidemic of senility and cognitive decline in this country. The cause of that is a lack of production of BDNF.
Dr. Ross, tell us what BDNF is.
Oh, sorry. Again, it's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's the protein that Kaushal was talking about earlier, that basically to have neuronal plasticity, you need this protein. This protein is what enables neurons to grow. It's what enables neurons to form new synaptic and dendritic connections. I mean, what is learning is you're forming new neural networks. And so you need the presence of this substance to be able to do that. Psychedelics are potent agonists of meaning they increase the production of BDNF very effectively. And so, you know, a lot of people get stuck in the psychedelic, the serotonin. So these psychedelics bind more than one receptor. The psychedelic experience or the psychotropic experience comes from, we believe, the 5-HT2, so there's a serotonin receptor that is bound. And that can account for a lot of sort of the visual, the auditory, the psychotropic experience. What we're talking about is there's another receptor, which these psychedelics also bind, which rapidly increase the production of the protein you need to be smart and to prevent cognitive decline. And so, sorry if I'm tangential, but our clientele happens to be, because they're affluent, these kinds of people. And we perform this service, and again, it was because we were going off the hard indications, anxiety, depression, PTSD. But I guess, and I think it's fantastic that the discussion starts with mental health, because we have a crisis, and it offers a solution, a potential solution. Kaushal alluded to it, doesn't work for everybody. It's not for everybody. There are hard medical contraindications to psychedelics. There are real reasons why people shouldn't use them. I think one of the things that is important to say, although this is tangential as well, is that, you know, people talk about these substances as safe, and they are, if they're used appropriately. But when you start using anything in the broader context, there are going to be issues and complications. And so, you know, I think we just have to be cognizant as this is sort of moving out into communities and into sort of broader consciousness that, you know, they need to be treated with respect.
There's no doubt safety will be a big piece of how we design this into communities and how it evolves.
But anyway, I digress. But
So
did I answer your question?
You did. I want to bring it back to Barina and Natasha and ask them a similar question about the evolution of the profile of the people you've seen coming into the space. Barina, from a legal perspective, who you're seeing coming in as potential clients and expressing interest in the space, and Natasha, who you're seeing, no doubt through a similar lens of, she is a wizard of you know, selling things. Sorry, the word blanked on me, but she's commercialized, as she said, a lot of products. So no doubt people are approaching her as well. So I'm curious how you've seen the space evolve with how people are coming into it, both from a commercial standpoint and from a user standpoint, if you've seen a change in the profile of people coming into the space.
Yeah, I'd say I've seen a big change. I mean, like I said, there have been so many dedicated practitioners doing this at risk to themselves when it was illegal, because they really believed in its potency and its efficacy. And so, you know, those folks are sometimes willing and sometimes unwilling to come out of the underground with state legalization. I think they're nervous and they're cautious about it, and I think that's probably the right approach, you know, in terms of trusting what's unrolled and how much it will protect them. So those guys have always sort of been in the field. There have been a lot of fringe folks, even with cannabis, that have come in, you know, alien churches. I love aliens, so no criticism of them, but like alien churches, people who want to use the medicine to commune with other dimensions, for climate change purposes. Like, there's the more, you know, unusual types that were in this space, I think, very early on. And then recently, it's, you know, it's a ton of professionals, it's a ton of people, it's a bunch of finance guys who are very successful, very wealthy, have run multiple successful businesses, and now they're interested in, you know, they had one psychedelic experience and they're like, wow, like, this is incredible, we need to do this, we need to facilitate this for other people. There are more people who either are or were doctors and want new ways to help their patients. I'd say it's, you know, just across the board now in terms of the types of people that are coming to law firms, at least in terms of wanting to start businesses in this space. It's really broad.
I would kind of echo those kind of things of what I'm seeing. I will say the thing that has been the most interesting to me in the last year as far as demographics, and like I've seen the full gamut. I mean, I've journeyed with people that are 80 years old, you know, through to people that are like obviously in their early 20s and everything in between. But the thing that has been the most common referral that has come my way in the last year is actually middle-aged and older men. And I think one of my biggest things that I'm seeing from that is that men, especially historically, haven't really had an outlet for damn near any emotional expression, period. And it's this kind of suck it up mentality that has been forced down people's throats that is incredibly detrimental, both to the individual and frankly their families, as this type of, you know, behavior goes on. So the number one demographic of my client right now are people that fit into that. And frankly, like, this is what this has given that demographic of people is something that, like, frankly, again, there's just not a lot of avenues for. And as this has gotten more and more popular and people have become more and more curious, I feel like if you're a woman, you're already, you know, inclined to have a community of women around you. Men are not. Right? When you see this like crisis of loneliness going on, like just, and we don't need to go into it, but incel, right? That community, you're seeing that with men, you're not seeing that with women. And so when you see from a society perspective of like, where's the pain the most intense? The pain is the most intense with men. And I'm not trying to discount that women, you know, have had it rough. Like, I mean, everyone already knows that. And I think that there's a lot of older men specifically who just haven't had an outlet, or frankly, the friends to just call their girlfriend and be like, you're never gonna believe this. I need to share this with you. You don't see that a lot. So that is the one thing about, I would say, the demographic of people that I'm seeing now that maybe is a little unexpected. And then as far as like the different, you know, kind of things that this is developing around, I think going back to the ketamine thing is like, obviously there's the mental element, the mental health element. But I mean, I can personally say that ketamine saved my life after I got in a catastrophic car accident 2 years ago, and I suffered unrelenting chronic pain, unrelenting. It was like the volume was always up, and I found a telehealth company called Joyful that prescribes me microdose ketamine lozenges, and I work with a nurse online, and I'm able to get that shipped to my house. So I think that what you're seeing here is like with ketamine, obviously the access is really great. You're gonna see really new and novel ways in which people are using these medicines. What's gonna be different about the psychedelics piece is that the product itself is not commercializable. The services around it are. So again, it's whatever ends up after the equal sign, right, is always going to have a lot to do with the things that add up or subtract before it. So what you see over here is going to have a lot to do with, you know, this plus that equals this. So I know it's kind of a weird way of looking at it, but it is, right? When you take the legal structure, plus the way that people are already doing things, plus the availability or not, this is the solution you're going to get on this side.
Really interesting. I can also just add that we certainly see here at the firm that there's a much wider spectrum of professionals coming into the space, whereas maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it was what you might consider more stereotypical expression of interest in psychedelics, whereas now we're certainly doctors and lawyers and engineers and a really interesting range of professionals coming into the space with all kinds of different interests, either being an entrepreneur or participating in the medicine itself, what have you. A question for Barina, and this I think relates well to where we just were. And we've talked about it. I'm curious, what is the most common format that you anticipate coming down the pipe here in the next few years? You said that regulated commercial access might begin in 2025. How can we anticipate that looking? What's your sense of that today, and how much more clarity do we need?
Well, so the regulated access model is being implemented through rulemaking right now. So there's a board of 15 people and subcommittees that don't vote, but kind of give recommendations up to the voting board. And so the entire regulated access piece is being determined by this board. So they have their hands really full right now. And you can, you know, I encourage anyone who's interested in this space to go attend the subcommittee meetings. They're all on Zoom. You can watch them, you can listen to them. Like, it's worth being involved in. So I think they're working hard right now to try to figure out what this is going to look like. But most realistically, I think if you're a patient, you go to a healing center and you say, hey, I want to do a psilocybin journey, or maybe in a few years I want to do an ibogaine journey. That's not as determined whether that will pan out. But you go in and you say you want to do this, and then you meet with the licensed facilitator who's gone through some state-mandated training to become a facilitator. And then you walk in and they do a certain amount of preparatory sessions to make sure that you're screened and you don't have all these contraindications, you don't have psychological or psychiatric conditions that would make it unsafe for you to do this. You do some other prep sessions about what you want to do with them, and then you go in, and then at the healing center they provide you with some psilocybin. And that's gone through and been third-party tested and sort of like stamped and labeled in accordance with state regulations. You do the journey. If there's any extra psilocybin, the healing center holds on to that, so it sort of stays in the state system. And then you come back for your integration session or sessions, and then you're basically done. And if you have a therapist or a doctor or whatever that encouraged you to do this, or that you see for general care, you maintain your relationship with them. This person doesn't now become your doctor or your day-to-day therapist.
So you would arrive there via a referral, most likely.
Yeah, I think you could probably walk in. This is the sort of stuff that's all being worked out right now, but I do think there's probably going to be licensed healing centers where you can just walk in. I think very often often the new people who are experiencing, I'm really passionate about finding out who's going to be touching psychedelics now that weren't before, because I think that's where we really need patient education, because these are the people that won't know what a good facilitator is versus a bad facilitator. And there's absolutely bad facilitators. Like, there's people you don't want to be in an altered state around, and they're out there now. And I have a lot of urgency around how we educate people. People who've been tripping for 20 years kind of know what the state is like, might know what to look for in a good facilitator, or they might be informed by other things, like they might do breath work, or they might do yoga, or they might do intensive women's work or men's work, and they know some of the questions at least to ask. But I think a lot of psychedelic naive people, as the studies call them, won't know what to look for. So as we're looking at trying to understand who this new population that's coming into the psychedelic space that hadn't touched it before are, I think a lot of those will come through referrals, or they'll come through, there'll be veterans who heard a veteran speak on a news show, or they read Michael Pollan's book or something. But I think a huge chunk of them will come because doctors who know this space are telling them, hey, this is an alternative, or therapists are like, you could do this instead of SSRIs.
Right. And in terms of the product itself, you touched on this, that the product would come from essentially regulated, controlled means. Would that mean that the psilocybin products to start would sort of be treated like marijuana products are today in Colorado, or how do you envision that regime unfolding?
Yeah, again, this is on the regulated
Sure.
side. On the personal use side, within strict parameters, there is cultivation and stuff allowed, and there's no sales on the personal use side. That's important to keep repeating. On the regulated side, it probably will look a bit like cannabis in that it will have testing requirements and labeling requirements. It will have to meet certain rules around not being adulterated or potency and all of that kind of thing. But then it won't be sold in a dispensary. You'll get it at the healing center, and then any of it that you don't use will go back to the healing center. You won't get a little doggy bag of psilocybin to take home with you.
Interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, where you have a highly regulated product that has labeling and testing and all sorts of things required, but maybe not any type of packaging or anything. So I think we started a little late. I think we've probably got about 15 minutes, Jason, or you tell me, 10 minutes? So, okay. I was going to open it up to Q&A shortly. I do have a couple more questions. I want to ask Natasha. I see you in the back there. So we are going to do Q&A, so if you have questions, just start putting your hands up, and I'll start taking them in the next couple minutes, and I do see you. So Natasha, one quick question for you. So we've been talking about doctors' offices and legalization, and we haven't even talked about how biopharmaceutical companies are coming into the space. So I'm curious, as the sort of designated culture person on the panel, how do you see the more traditional mainstream elements and the sort of mainstreaming of psychedelics impacting the existing culture and communities that are out there around psychedelics?
I think one of the things that I've seen is if you get on Instagram, granted I'm not on social media and I got off years ago, but I know this exists. There's folks that are like Instagram self-proclaimed shamans and all sorts of, You know, it's kind of more about like the headpieces that are being worn and the lighting in the photo than it is about the work itself. So there's a whole, I think, obviously, as things come out and have any level of trendiness to them, you're always going to see people that are frankly capitalizing on the trend more than they are really intending to be a part of, you know, a community or a movement, or whatever that is. So I think that you always are going to have, you know, kind of stuff like that. But going back to this, I think that, you know, like I'm a part of a community that is national in its nature. People all over the country, everyone knows everyone. In different cities, people host different smaller communities. Sometimes our communities mix and match, and there's a whole, and a lot of people have communities like this. And so it's just a matter of like if they talk about it or not, and you know, how that kind of element around it. Let's see, I feel like there's something else you'd ask me to clarify.
Well, how the kind of mainstreaming of these things are going to affect the existing culture.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's different that you're seeing more in Western culture than you have seen, at least from, you know, some of the things that I've heard around like medicine and indigenous cultures, and frankly, I think we need it a lot more here, is around integration. So people are having these like, you know, incredible experiences, right? And that's awesome, right? That's great. The real transformation, the real healing, the rubber hitting the road of you know, growth is integration. And when you know, indigenous communities are community-based, right? People have a village. We don't necessarily have that here, and I kind of spoke to the crisis of loneliness, right? So like when you see what's going to be very different here, and frankly, this is for everyone to know, is like if you're serious about doing this work, you have to be really serious about doing this work. It's not a one-trick pony where, you know, you drop your little magic mushrooms and have, you know, a psychedelic experience that may be awe-inspiring or absolutely horrifying. I mean, it could anything in the realm of infinite possibilities, anything is possible. And the number one thing that I share with people is like really where the most important area of your investment should be is around the integration. And that, what do I mean by that? The meaning making, right? If you come from a community, I feel like, and we'll just be using, again, vague generalizations of Western society where there's maybe not as much of a connection to historic or symbolic language or of tools that maybe, you know, are part of this, or community elders who are a source of wisdom, right? Like we need more guidance on the meaning making. And so you're seeing, like, obviously there's the healing centers, and Brina mentioned this, but like what is actually, I think you're going to see a lot more of if we do this right as individuals and as communities and as groups, is around the open conversation around integration of, okay, well, that sounds awesome that you saw, you know, a little green man jumping up and down with rainbows spraying out of his eyeballs, but what does that mean to you, right? Like, how is this impacting your life? And what does this say to you, you know? So us all as, you know, people that are interested in this or already doing this work, I think we already know this word integration, but it's the number one thing that I share with people when they contact me is like, okay, so you want to do this? And like, I've had to turn people away because they're like, yeah, I want to come for a night. And I'm like, okay, well, great. So let's talk about the integration. Can you commit to me that you're going to stay for until it's done before you leave my house? And not to mention, like, are you able to schedule a call with me in advance and hold a 2-week appointment to go deeper into how this is unfolding? And after that conversation, who do you have in your community that you can call if I'm not available, right? Like, there's a whole litany of things that come along with this, because as somebody who's been doing this work for 20 years, I might have an amazing experience, and I'm still integrating things that happened in my experiences a decade ago. And so having the language around the meaning making in Western cultures is going to be the most important thing, or else we get sucked into the phenomena, which is what this can be, right? There's a difference between what happened in an experience and what it means. So being able to tease those two apart is going to be really important, I think, for our society, especially around, again, the meaning making and bringing into the community so that we have each other and we're not doing this alone in isolation, because that's not working very well.
Thank you, Natasha. All right. Question in the back, and yeah, we'll start taking them.
If someone's on traditional meds for depression, how do you integrate this with that? And is it a matter of integrating it for 1 or 2 sessions? Do you wean them off of those meds? Do they continue with those meds, or just change them up, reduce them? How would that look?
It depends. Everybody's different. And I echo what Natasha said about the integration, but it's also a lot of the answers to those questions have a lot to do with the intention, meaning like, why are you coming to these medications, this medication, depending on what we're talking about, and what goals do you have? And so the answer is it varies, but in short, can you get off traditional pharmacologic medications with a relatively short course of psychedelic therapy? The answer is yeah, absolutely. It's totally possible. Doesn't work for everybody that way, but it's possible.
Yeah, and I'd just add there's some medications that you don't want to stop abruptly, and so you need to have that conversation with your doctor and sort of integrate the ketamine therapy or some other psychedelic therapy in a progressive kind of way. I've had patients in really rural areas in this country kind of reach out and say, like, look, I've been doing electroshock therapy for depression, and I'm really traumatized for these reasons. There's a ketamine clinic right down the street, but they won't do it until I get off my antidepressants, which is really challenging for some patients. They can't get off their antidepressants, and it's really risky. It's really dangerous. And so, at least in my personal practice, I try to integrate the two and then eventually wean them off of the SSRI or some other conventional antidepressant. So.
My question's on commercialization and kind of future state of things. So, seeing that a lot of people get their insurance through their employers, self-funded employers, kind of have the ability to contract with a facility like yours directly rather than playing in that fee-for-service space. They're governed federally, but if they have populations here, they could be contracting with you for the services, maybe not the product. And if it's a CEO that had a great experience, there may be a stigma to kind of funnel it down to the rest of the employees. And so I'm curious as to where you see, future state of this, and if employers have a pathway to kind of help their people, because behavioral health is the number one question that they're getting from their young employees in the future state of work.
I have one example that I think you might find interesting, and I'm drawing a blank of the name of the insurance provider, but there are cutting edge companies. I don't how many of you all have seen Dr. Bronner's soap, right? Yeah? So the Bronner's family, who it's still a family-owned company, are one of the largest contributors to psychedelic research, full stop, giving away $20+ million to MAPS and to other organizations doing this work, Zendo, which does community-based harm reduction. And someone in the family had suffered from depression, had amazing experience with ketamine, and they brought that to their employees. If you're an employer at Dr. Bronner's, you now have access to ketamine therapy. There's only one insurance company that I know that has been able to provide that, and they're using them. I could find the name if you wanted to connect on the information. But so I think that you will start to see this around things, again, with ketamine, because it's not scheduled in the same way. As these things become more and more available, and I mean, I think that for anyone who's interested in this, look at what's gone on in cannabis and how long it's taken, and look at how fast we've gotten with psychedelics. Way faster if you don't know much about cannabis. So I think that as these things get descheduled, and obviously the legal stuff, and I'm not an expert on that, but what I can say is, like, as availability becomes more and more available and the risk for supporting these types of therapies goes down, more and more people are going to enter because there's an opportunity there. So for progressive companies, it's already happening. But again, there's only one insurance provider that is offering this right now.
Can I just add one quick point? I mean, one of the reasons our clinic operates outside of the insurance paradigm is because there's a lot of bureaucracy built into that. And if the insurer is the primary payer, and their objective is, like any other company, to make a profit, it's in their best interest to minimize payouts as much as possible. And so not just for mental health, but say cardiovascular health, cancer, they, at least from our experience, they don't want to pay for some of the tests that have been demonstrated to be much superior to some of the conventional lab tests that are out there, like a conventional lipid panel devised in the 70s cost $5 versus more advanced testing that are more accurate, more reflective of your cardiovascular risk profile, but they're more expensive. So insurance is not going to want to pay for those better tests. And so we've kind of taken a stance to to just get out of that paradigm entirely, because that would, if we work with insurance companies, it would mean introducing several administrators into our clinic that does the coding, and then there's going to be a back and forth, there's going to be a delay in compensation, and then we're going to be back to seeing patients every 15 minutes as opposed to spending a significant portion of time with them. And I think where I do see an opportunity to work with insurers is if we can demonstrate to them, you know, apples to apples, like, look, we're reducing heart attack risk, we're reducing risk of cancer, and in the long term, it is in the best interest of the insurer to work with us. The stream that we have to swim up against is that most people don't stay with the same insurer for very long. And so the counter argument to what I just said is like, look, this patient is not going to stay with our company for more than 3 years or 5 years, so it's not in our best interest to look after their long-term health. Just give them their antidepressant and that's it. And so I think you bring up a really good, important question, but right now we're trying to brainstorm internally about how to work with insurers, but those are some of the challenges from on our end.
Sorry, we are out of time. So I just got the hook. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you to our great panelists for all your wisdom, and enjoy Denver Startup Week.